Hi, and welcome to Academics of PA. We're glad to be back. I don't know if we'd call this season 2 or what. I don't think we're quite that advanced, but this is Bruce McDonald. Thank you for joining me. I have, of course, the ever fabulous Josie Schafer.
Well, thank you so much. And hi, everyone. Thanks for listening.
Today I have with me Carolyn Bourdeaux from Georgia State University, who is also running for the U.S. Congress. So it is a treat and honor to have you with us.
Well, thank you for having me.
Most of the guests, one of the things we kind of start off with is talking about what drove them to public administration as a field, because they're typically highly academically oriented, but your background's a little bit different because you actually come from not just the practitioner side, but the political side of the practitioner side. So I guess probably maybe more than asking what drove you to public administration, maybe what brings you or what has drawn you to public service as a whole.
Right. So, well, there are many things. You know, I'm the daughter of teachers, and both my parents had a very strong commitment to education and to public service. So, in many respects, I was kind of raised with that mentality or the idea that, you know, that's just kind of what you do with your life. When I graduated from college, I thought, okay, you know, I want to do public service. I had a lot of student debt, so I knew I needed a job. I couldn't just go volunteer somewhere. I couldn't, afford to do Peace Corps or things like that. So I went to Washington and I started working for several congressmen, but ended up working for Congressman Ron Wyden from Oregon, and he is still there. He ran for Senate while I was there, and that was a great experience. But when I was around 27 or so, I thought, here I am writing legislation and the laws of the land, and I really ought to have more knowledge before I do that. And so I went and I talked to lots of folks about, different careers in public service. And one of the most interesting people I talked to was Wendell White, who was the city manager of Charlotte. Is that his name? I think it's Wendell White. And he was just great. And he really kind of inspired me to think about public administration. And so I applied to a bunch of public administration programs. And, I was thinking, I kind of had my eye on either a PhD program or becoming a city manager. I went to University of Southern California, right, and got my MPA. And then I thought, I need more. This was just a taste. I really am so interested in this. And so then I got my PhD at Syracuse. And really, what I'm always interested in, I've always been interested in, is good public policy, and how we do good for people. And, it's not particularly complicated. When I think of the times in my life where I've done something that I felt was meaningful and important and gave me joy, it is always a time where, I've been able to use my capacity and knowledge to solve problems for folks that in a way that makes their lives better.
Did your parents teach, out of curiosity?
Yeah, so it's a long and complicated story, but my father taught high school and taught literature, English, and then went back to school, got his PhD in education, and taught teachers how to teach. And my mother, who had been an artist when I was growing up, actually was a tapestry artist. My family had some very serious financial problems, and so my mother had to go back to teaching. She'd done a little bit in her early career, and so my father then taught her how to teach, and she taught, many subjects, but she taught mostly history and civics. And then she went on to become a principal and ended her career as a principal in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. But one of her sort of career highlights was that she was the principal of Prince Edward County High School in Farmville, Virginia, which was one of the Brown versus Board of Education high schools. And, it was a place where she really felt like, she worked very hard and felt like she was really able to make a very meaningful contribution to the community.
Oh, that's really neat. Did your dad ever kind of, given his experience of teaching teachers, did that ever roll into anything of him giving you advice or recommendations or telling you how to do the job of being a professor?
Yes. Absolutely. And he passed away a year and a half ago. And
I'm
one
sorry.
of the really sad things is, I'm teaching now, and usually at night, I teach at night. And so, I'd get out of class and have to drive home, and I'd always call him and kind of debrief the class. It was sort of one of our fun things we did. So it's been sad not to be doing that. But he also, one of the classes I've taught is a class that has a big ethics component, and he taught ethics, and that was one of the things he loved thinking about and talking about. And so that was something we would talk about a lot, and how to teach that, and uh, what was important to emphasize. And then he was full of great stories that I would often incorporate into my classes as well.
That's really cool. Yeah, I'm not really I'm trying to think if there's any stories that I could ever use from my dad in terms of pulling into my classes, but
Yeah. Well, yeah. Here, I'll give you one. Maybe folks would. So
okay.
there was maybe folks would be interested in this. So one of the stories uh, he would tell me was actually about my mother. So when he was helping my mother sort of get back into the teaching career path, she was giving out the final grades in her class, and the principal came to her, and there was a young man who wanted to go into the military, and he was from a foster care, had a foster care background, had been in a group home, really, really tough life. And he was set up, he was going to fail her class, and the principal came to her and said, if you fail him, that will be the one thing that will keep him from, getting into the military. They won't accept him. He won't have I guess, the GPA high enough to take him. And we'd like you not to fail him. And so, what do you do? And so that's something I often pose to my class, as something to think about. He didn't earn the grade, uh, but at the same time, that grade was going to affect his life, his future, his potential, his ability to escape, most likely, his life circumstances. And so anyway, that's one story we often used and talked about. I'll say one other thing about the story, which is interesting to me, which is that, and I talk to my students about this as well, which is that my view of that has changed over the years. When I was younger and sort of more tied to the grades and, what it takes to get a grade and the fairness in getting grades, I was much more on the side of course, you don't change the grade, that's, you get a grade, you have to earn it, right? And as I've gotten older, and seen more of life, I'm definitely on the other side now. I'm like, that grade is a small thing in the greater scheme of things, and to give this young man a chance at a better life is, may outweigh the grade. And so there may be different circumstances, ways you can pitch it, give him some different work to do or things like that. But so anyway, we often talk about that. So what is the right choice? And I've, as you get older, your views on sort of where you stand on different issues change.
Yeah. One of the things I think is interesting about your career is you do have that experience on the Hill, which prior to my academic career, straight out of undergrad, I spent a couple years on the Hill, and I had that same kind of experience of looking around going, well, we're developing policy, we're coming up with recommendations, and yet the vast majority of people I knew either only had a bachelor's, or a surprisingly large percentage of them had never actually finished their undergrad. They went to DC, started their internship, kind
Yeah.
of got the job, and then just stuck around without going back to finish. And I definitely had that same kind of perspective going, there's answers out there. We should be trying to figure out how to
Yeah.
do this better, or figure out what the answers should be.
Well, I think there's several things. I just to go back, I did the time on the Hill. I also, was director of the Senate Budget Office here in Georgia. So several times, and then a lot of what I did at the Andrew Young School did involve a lot of community service and outreach work. But in terms of the young folks, in Washington doing a lot of the policy, what I always thought about was that I would put together a kitchen cabinet of folks around any issue that I was dealing with, who really did have kind of that policy knowledge and depth. So I don't despair that at all that, it's young folks, really kind of pulling the pieces together. Many of them are very smart and very sharp. And certainly in Washington, they have an enormous amount of expertise that they can draw from.
Oh, absolutely.
That being said, I do think it helps an awful lot to be the person who really does have some depth of knowledge about public policy, about the different trade-offs, about the choices, what your options are in dealing with different policy arenas. And it helps you be more adept. It helps you craft policy that is more meaningful, more thoughtful, more likely to be successful if someone does have an MPA or other forms of education that really kind of enrich their knowledge about public policy.
You said you came into the MPA after the Hill, but of course before working with the Senate Budget Evaluation Office. How much of the stuff that you studied during the MPA and during the PhD
Right.
kind of came back and said, oh, here's why we were doing?
What was interesting was when I got to the budget office, the Great Recession started, and Georgia's revenues started dropping. I started in December of 2007, and by December of 2008, we were in the heart of a fiscal crisis. And it was funny, I'd read, all the literature on budget gimmicks, really, and all the different ways that you try to forestall making cuts. But these were all not in the context of a recession, but just in the context of, people trying to avoid, having to make hard choices. And so I was able to go back and think, gosh, I know all the different ways that you can move numbers around to try to, forestall having to make certain choices. And in this case, it was important to do that just to keep the state's nose above water, just what were the different reserves that we could move around, what were the different ways, accounting practices that we could change. And so it was enormously useful, all the knowledge that I had in helping the state balance the budget. And so it was perhaps not what you'd expect, but it was a situation where the state's budget dropped by 20%.
Oh, wow.
And it was just an incredible effort to throw whatever we could, into the gap to just try to keep basic services running. So it was very educational as well to do it. I'll give you one other vignette of sort of, where that policy background came into play, which was there was an effort to consolidate agencies, right, as a cost savings measure. And it was interesting to me. Well, actually, there was some efforts to consolidate, but simultaneously efforts to break apart agencies. And of course, anybody who studied organizational theory or the history of different, how we've approached public agencies, at various times in the 70s, for instance, we went through a whole period where we thought, oh my goodness, we've got all these different fragmented structures. We need to bring them all together, and having one enormous agency will make it so much more efficient and so much more coordinated. But then we did that and we realized, wait a minute, that's creating all sorts of communications problems and creating this massive bureaucracy, and nobody's able to get anything done because of the problems going up and down this incredible, hierarchy. And so all of that knowledge was very, very helpful as we tackled the budget crisis. And I was able to talk with the legislators about, explain to them that they're not going to get what they think they're going to get from, either consolidating agencies or splitting them apart. That's not necessarily going to be a big savings to them. And so anyway, one of the many, many ways that having sort of that historical knowledge, that policy knowledge helped in decision making.
Perhaps if I can also kind of flip the question, was there anything that you wish you had known or that you wish you had picked up in the degrees along the way that kind of would have helped?
No, I do think a bit about how we do deliver the public finance degrees, or the degrees with sort of that focus on budgeting and finance. And, really do think we need to make sure that students are not just grounded in basic budgeting, but they need to be conversant in accounting and in debt management and some of the management of long-term liabilities. And so it did give me the perspective that we need to have a very well-rounded education in public finance. And so actually was one of the reasons I went back to the Andrew Young School, and we created the Center for State and Local Finance that has a CFO, Chief Financial Officer training program that emphasizes these different areas and can help people who are in the field in public finance have sort of a more well-rounded and balanced knowledge of public finance.
Sorry, my pause is kind of thinking about this in terms of the context of what NASPA does, because a few years ago, NASPA had the idea about requiring programs to start doing the assessments and everything for their concentrations. And so a lot of the different sections of NASPA went through and kind of started creating, I don't know if you'd call them objectives, or a list of outcomes of what you should learn from the different perspectives.
I think there should be some effort, and I don't know if NASPA tried this, but to go out and survey people in the field and say, what do you need to know? What did you need to know to take on this particular type of job? And I think particularly, so when I think about when we're teaching folks in public finance, in budgeting, most of the programs I'm familiar with, we're teaching people to go into jobs like the Office of Management and Budget, Office of Planning and Budget, which are more, which develop the overall budget for the state or for the federal government, and are very policy oriented at a certain level. You're doing policy with numbers, but a lot of it is, very much about evaluating different trade-offs between different programs. But that's in sharp contrast to someone who is becoming a chief financial officer at the local level, or going into a finance shop at a local level or at an agency level often, where what you're learning is much more, you have to know much more transactional details about how these systems work and integrate. And that's something that I've talked to folks about in the field, that we need to recognize and have systems for developing people who are going into those more operational tracks.
Yeah. It's interesting because as soon as NASPA started talking about developing these concentrations and the assessment of them, and the section started working on it, a lot of programs started dropping their concentrations, which led to NASPA kind of backing off their plan, except that the budget and finance section of NASPA actually went through and finished kind of creating what theirs was, and they did it in combination with the ICMA, they did it in combination with the GFOA, and I believe the Association of Governmental Accountants. And so it's been created kind of, here's this list of what you should learn from the budget and finance side, but then they've never done anything with it.
Right.
There's been a small group of us who go to NASPA who have been kind of pushing for at least some kind of conversation around what these are, so that your programs can actually start to think about it. Which, there's a lot more to being successful at.
Change is difficult, and part of it also is connecting with folks in the field and making sure that they are getting the education they need. So we kind of approached it a different way. What I did was set up a bunch of fellowships through the Center for State and Local Finance, and young folks come in, they get some assistance with tuition, and they work for the Center for State and Local Finance doing projects. And then they are run through our executive education program. And we paired them together, the executive education program, so that they could be treated as a regular class. And so what we did then is we were recruiting in the students who would take the class, and then move on to a career in public finance. And those students are just snapped up. We can't support more than 10 or so of them at any time, but it's a great track. They learn a tremendous amount, and we're able to give them that some more rich knowledge about public finance. It's just been hard to do through our regular MBA program.
No, I think that's a great way of doing it.
It's kind of connecting the students coming into the marketplace,
right.
And that has always been the challenge.
Carolyn, you made a wonderful comment about reaching out to those in practice and that being a critical component of MPA programs. So maybe you can expand on some of the other strategies you've used to stay engaged with the public.
I think I'm very fortunate that I'm at a school that really values outreach into the community. And so when I left the budget office and came back to the Andrew Young School, I helped found the Center for State and Local Finance. And that really had a mission of not only doing research in public finance, but also outreach to the community, technical assistance, and then education. And so what we did was bring in graduate students to both go through our public finance, sort of enhanced public finance track, which is also open to practitioners who can come in and take those classes. And then those students also serve as researchers on lots of projects that are needed in the community. And I think one of the challenges in the public sector and sort of with the MPA programs and MPP programs is that a lot of the academic research that we do is too sometimes is too abstract, really, for what needs to actually happen in the field. But also, practitioners are starving for basic descriptive research often. There are just any number of public policy problems where they just need a comparison, maybe across counties, of how different counties do a particular project. They don't need sort of academic level, regression analysis. They don't need that level of analytic sophistication. And so one of the things we were able to do at the center is just do that basic descriptive research that is just so valuable to folks out in the field. So those are some ways I've continued to try to be involved.
In terms of kind of thinking about the types of research that practitioners need,
Yep.
based off of your experience on the Hill, based off of your experience with the Georgia Senate, how can we as academics really do better in terms of working on the types of projects that are going to be useful to people in those positions?
Yes. So I think it is very helpful to go out and just talk to people about what is important to them, what they need. Pick certain areas where you may see a particular need. So some examples of the projects we did. One was on community improvement districts, which are like business improvement districts, but Georgia has a very enhanced version of a business improvement district that has a lot more power. And these are just semi-autonomous governments, pretty much. They are business community members. They're people who own property. They tax themselves a little bit, set up their own little government to enhance, their community. So we just did a whole descriptive report on that. What do these things do? How do you create them? How many have been created in Georgia? Where are they? When do they come into existence? How do they go out of existence? And just a really rich, it was, I think it was almost a 100-page report on these types of institutions. And that was something we did through the Center for State and Local Finance. We went out and asked for some of the community improvement districts to provide some funding to help support it, and some of the economic development community to support it. And that report, to this day, is one of the go-to resources for folks who are interested in creating a community improvement district or to evaluating one that they already have in existence. So that's one thing. So that was kind of where there was a community need, and they came to us and said, we would like this. And sort of going in the other direction, one of the things I realized when I was talking to lots of local governments was that, I had worked and helped implement Georgia's tax expenditure budget. And for those of you who don't know what that is, a document that details the fiscal impact of all the different tax credits, exemptions, and deductions in the state code, so that someone can go in there and say, oh, Georgia has a jobs tax credit. How does it work? And how much is it costing the state to have that policy in place? And what I realized talking to local governments was that they needed something like that too. And they have a more interesting situation. in a certain sense, which is that they in Atlanta or in the metro area, there are multiple overlapping governments that are poaching the tax base from each other. And so as I talked with folks in the Atlanta metro area, I was able to say, I think it'd be really interesting to try out a local tax expenditure budget. So that was one where we put the proposal together. We pointed out all the different places where folks are, kind of impacting one another. And then we went to the Arnold Foundation and pitched that as a project. And that was something we got funded. So I think part of it is really being out there and talking to and listening to folks in the community. And, when you're doing that in a really active way, a lot, you see all sorts of opportunity for ways that you can be helpful.
So one of the things that I'm grappling with in my new position aligns with a lot of what you just said, right? What is the level of research that people need? What is the research they need right now and in a timely way? And that's, I think, a really difficult one. Sometimes by the time I know about the issue, they already need the research and I'm not ready. But sort of the last one is, how do we communicate it in a meaningful way where you don't necessarily need an MPA to understand it and work through it? You can see something really quickly and go, oh, this has meaning for me, right? I don't have to always go through a big report. And I'm wondering if that's something you have thought about and put some effort to in your outreach and engagement work.
Yep. And that was very much also a part of what we tried to do with the center, was communicating, and crossing that bridge is so important. So we had a bunch of things we did. We would put out issue briefs, right? So shortened versions or synopses of the larger reports. We would, anytime we put out a report, we would look for different conferences or places where we could go present the research. We would look for opportunities to put out op-eds or ways to reach out to the local newspapers or other sort of local publications, and to convey the research through that. And then last of all, we built out a big newsletter to as many people as were interested, and we are always kind of updating folks through that newsletter of new research that's out there, and giving them synopses and overviews of what the findings are, what the key takeaways are.
In terms of the research that's included in the newsletter, is that just stuff that comes out of the center, or do y'all kind of focus a little bit more broadly in terms of here's the research academically that might pertain back to the audience?
For our newsletter, we largely focused on research coming out of the center or research coming out of the Andrew Young School that we thought was germane to folks. And that's enough from our point of view. There was plenty to absorb there, plenty to digest there. But I do think, you're hinting at something that I think would be enormously useful for folks is, could we have a publication? I think actually Governing Magazine does some of this pretty well. And taking some of the research and findings and trying to translate it for practitioners in a way that feels very real, down to earth to them. But I think there's room for a lot more of that.
I'm thinking of it in terms of, you have PAR has, whenever they publish an article, there's a couple little highlight points. Public Budgeting and Finance, I believe, is starting to do something similar. And a number of different journals have kind of developed that little, here's the bullet point for the practitioner, which is a start.
That still doesn't get to them, right? We still have the problem of the way your newsletter connected to groups of people that knew they could trust you and knew they were interested in the work that you were doing. They wanted the newsletter from you, but PAR or some of the academic journals, when they include those practitioners' points, one, do people know to go there? And does it resonate without that personal connection or that relationship that this person does something I care about?
Yeah, so I think you're correct, right? For the most part, a lot of people in the field are not really reading Public Budgeting and Finance or PAR. I think if you look at governing, for instance, when it's delivering its message to folks. Just having those bullet points is good. I mean, it's not a bad start, but some of it really is, it's helpful to do it with storytelling. And you see that in a lot of newspapers and articles, that talk about a public policy issue. Often they will start off with an example. Here was a student who went to this charter school and had been at a school where she was in classes of 50 students, and now she was at the charter school and she was there and able to receive the individualized care she needed. They'll start off with that story, and then they'll go into research shows. And so I think there's a whole art to connecting policy findings to people in the field and to being relevant to them. And I think we could do a lot more to translate sort of what we found into a meaningful policy dialogue with people who are out there, actually in the field doing the work.
Hearing you say that now, I was thinking about the story from earlier in the conversation. We were talking about the gentleman needing to pass the class in order to join the military, where it's this kind of a case study, the vignette that draws the person in, that then you then utilize as the tool to relay back kind of what the meaning or the discussion around the material should be. Kind of makes me then think in terms of the way to relate research back to practitioners is kind of the same way we relate stuff in the classroom. It's all about teaching, here's what the issue is, here's why it matters.
Well, one of the interesting things about politics is that, as they talk to you about how to convey a message, a lot of folks will very much emphasize that you need to do storytelling. You need to tell a story, and that is what brings people into a conversation or into understanding a concept. And it just occurred to me as we're talking that, that may be something we need to think about, is how do we, that's a very, very important part of communication. And I wonder if we've lost that to some degree as we kind of do these scientific articles and scientific analysis and research.
I remember one article or one manuscript that I submitted for review. It was actually a pretty tight article. It was published, but in the beginning I added a little story, and every reviewer just could not handle that being there. It wasn't founded. It wasn't accurate. It was off topic. And so I had to take it out. But it was an attempt at being not necessarily more relevant, but connecting it to what this means rather than stating the policy implications, right? Giving an example of the policy implications. And it just did not belong there. And I think that's one of the challenges and one of the opportunities for academia. Once it's in the journal, we need to find other places for it too, and other ways of telling the story. And it does make the work harder and longer. But if the goal is for our research to inform practice in any way, then I think it is a bit up to us to find a way to share it beyond the journal.
I agree. And I think we need to, the other challenge in academia, versus sort of how we interact, is that we are not typically rewarded for that, right? We are rewarded for sitting behind our desk and, churning out journal articles that are published in top journals. We are rewarded for getting great evaluations in our classes. And that's it. And I know a lot of universities are starting to think about this, and certainly the Andrew Young School did, and was one of the things that really attracted me to it, was that they cared about whether you were relevant, whether you're out in the community, and they had a category called synergy, and that was taken up in our evaluations. And so I think, really thinking about the field and what it is we value and do we reward that is something we need to continue to discuss.
What all kind of got incorporated into the synergy category?
It was it was cooperative efforts. So if you reviewed your peers' articles and gave them good feedback, it was being in the community. So when I was a young assistant professor and I did this report on tax increment financing, and I didn't, I just did it kind of for the Fiscal Research Center at the time, and then presented it. And I must have had, over 100 people show up to my presentation on this topic. And it was not an academically particularly relevant, it was not again, sort of that regression analysis. It was much more descriptive, but it was very, very important to the community. And that was something that got put into my evaluation, which meant a lot to me, that was viewed positively by the Andrew Young School.
I don't think that many schools, at least in my experience, that many schools have that degree of a measurement incorporated into the evaluation. I mean, NC State allows a certain measure of service and expectation, and we can kind of define that how we want to, but doesn't play that large of a role in much of anything outside that allows us to say that we do it.
Yeah. Yeah. And your other problem is that your marketability is affected also, right? So if you produce lots and lots of those kinds of reports that are descriptive and talk about, different cases of how it's been used, and it's not something that really fits in an academic journal, and you don't have that publication then on your resume or your CV when you're going up for tenure or applying for job, that's a challenge. It's not just the school can't do it alone. It's got to be interlocked into the profession overall.
Are there recommendations in terms of how we can start approaching different programs and thinking about making those changes so that it can become disciplinary wide?
I mean, I think having conversations at NASPA would be, a good step. I think it's worth having a conversation with folks about, how relevant are we? How much of our research is really, affecting people, affecting change? And, what does it take to really do that? To be relevant to what people need in the field, to be on the research topics that are important to people, and then have our research feed back into the decisions that are actually made on the front lines.
I think we've heard that very consistently through the podcast. I mean, Bruce, do you think that's true? That we should be talking about how we can have more effect on practice?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. So hopefully this podcast will do some of it. If so many senior scholars are saying that's important to us and that's what we want to do and that's what we're training people to do, I think it'll be nice that a lot of people get to hear that is sort of a prevailing feeling about the field of public administration.
Yeah, it is. It's funny. This discussion has been going on for a long time. And I think, thinking about concrete ways to address the issue, we need to sit down and have some real discussions about that. I think just throw out another thing, so one is kind of having the publications that translate the research, that might be some kind of one way to approach it. Another one is to think about how we value the scholarship that we're putting out. And the last thing is to have potentially people who do that translational work, who are out in the community, finding out what's going on, linking together the resources of the community, the needs of the community with the students and with the faculty.
Oh, those are great points. I do want to change the direction of the conversation just a little bit given the timing. You made the decision a couple of years ago to run for Congress from last fall, and then now you're running again for the 2020 election, which I think is absolutely fascinating and awesome, but it is definitely very different than what most academics will do in their career. What prompted you to run for Congress, and what has that experience really been like for you?
So I was prompted to run for two reasons. One was what's happened with healthcare in our country. And I was director of the budget office and sort of watched the rise of the Tea Party and this kind of enormous fracturing in our political system. And it has really affected healthcare. So Georgia has not expanded Medicaid, and that means that it leaves on the table, I guess the latest estimate is $3 billion a year from the federal government. And there are different numbers, but 230,000 people or so fall into the gap where they are too poor to get assistance to purchase insurance on the exchange, right? So the healthcare exchange helps people from 100% of poverty and above, but if you're 100% poverty and below, you are too poor to get a subsidy. And I have explained that hundreds and hundreds of times, and every time everybody says, really, what? Wait, that doesn't make sense. And of course it does not. And so Georgia, in rejecting the Medicaid money, made a choice that is fiscally very irresponsible for the state, and to my mind is really morally wrong. You just don't hang people out to dry that way. And so that was one big issue for me. I was very frustrated in watching that debate unfold. And I feel like the only reason for it is politics, which is, people have lost their line of sight to people and what people need. And then with the election of President Trump, I teach a class called Public Service and Democracy about how our system works. And the number one thing I try to convey to people is how fragile our democracy is and how it requires people of good faith to be in it for it to work. And I think we see that challenge right now in ways that are very dangerous to our country. And so it just seemed to me that, if you have the knowledge, you have the background, and you see what is happening to us, at this point in our history, and you have the space to run for office, that you should. You have an obligation to do it, in a sense. And so that's kind of why I ran. I was like, I have this window in my life where I can do it. I didn't have it before, and I might not have it in the future, but right now I do. And I can bring to bear enormous resources on these different problems if I'm elected. And not least of which I will say is the wonderful policy community that has supported me in this race. Some of my biggest supporters, many people who have weighed in, are people in the policy community from all over the country who have helped me do this. And I have such a wonderful network of people who are experts in their fields, who I think it would just be a wonderful way to make a real impact on the future and so that's kind of why I got into it. The next question was, what have I learned? What was the next part of that question?
Right. So kind of what did you learn about the experience? What's your takeaway been from it? I know that's a heavy question to ask, but
well, I think the underlying reasons I'm running have not changed, right? This race ended up being the closest in the country. This was a seat that many people did not think could be won, or one where we could even get close, but we were able to pull that off with enormous effort. One of the things, though, I would say sort of a key takeaway is how badly broken our system is. It is what we ask candidates to do is basically chain themselves to a chair and do fundraising all day, every day, day in and day out, in order to be able to stand up a campaign that can that can garner votes, because you have to purchase time on TV, which is enormously expensive. But also you have to do that in order to stand up against enormous PAC money, corporate interests, very, very wealthy people who just pour money into this process. And it is a badly broken system, and it is going to be very hard to attract people of talent into it if we continue to operate this way. So I tell people, I am doing the campaign the way I'm doing it, which is working on the fundraising and that outreach. But I'm doing it so our children don't have to do it this way. This is crazy. You cannot ask people to do this kind of work and give up their lives to do it and expect to have people of talent and quality go into this, run for Congress. I think a lot of folks see the national emergency, and so we have drawn an enormously talented freshman class of legislators. But I think this is going to be an ongoing issue, that we have to have a system that allows people who are interested in public service, who are interested in good public policy, to get into this, without the money that is required to do this type of campaign.
So you bring up such a good point, and probably a great point for a lot of us in academia who come to be academics because we are interested and engaged and watching politics. But I think probably a lot of us feel like that no one wants to make that jump. And the money, the scrutiny, the media, I think all of those are real disincentives. Yet, who more qualified and knowledgeable and engaged to do the work? So you certainly set up that problem, but can you talk a little bit about what made you move forward? Just, I understand and I know and I'm in it, but it's worth it.
That's right. Yeah, no, I see this as, we're at a time of national emergency, and, we are calling on all people of good faith to engage in our system. It is both the challenge to our Constitution and our democracy that is posed by this president, is a challenge to our democracy that is posed by the enormous and just staggering polarization in the electorate. And then we face policy challenges that are very important. And, our generation is called now. It's our turn to step up. Our parents' generation dealt with, the civil rights movement and the environmental movement, women's movement. They were part of an enormous amount of social change. Our grandparents, I, kind of see where I am. I'm in my late 40s here, but my grandparents fought World War II and dealt with the Great Depression. And I just feel like it's our generation's call. We have to deal with renewing our democracy and then confronting a whole series of policy issues. Healthcare is kind of the pocketbook one, but the big existential threats we face, are, fiscal crisis at the federal level, given our tremendous national debt, and climate change, and the existential threat to our environment and to humanity itself. And so, now's the time to be engaged.
I don't know if this is appropriate, but I'd move to Georgia just to vote for you.
Thank you.
I remember in November watching the election results come in, and I was sitting at a bar here in Raleigh, and you lost by only 433 votes. So it was really, really close. But as everybody is, kind of sitting around watching the TVs and everything coming in, it was a lot of fun to be able to be like, I know her. Because everybody was cheering every time the results came back, because North Carolina is highly Republican, except for Raleigh, Durham, and Charlotte. And so it was, everybody was in there kind of going, okay, well, we have this opportunity to make changes from what, has really been going on. And so it was a room full of people outside of Georgia who was actually rooting for you, which is really fun to watch.
Thank you. I so appreciate it.
We are kind of running towards the end in terms of time, but I did have one last question I wanted to ask. Since there is this responsibility that you've mentioned about needing to be involved, needing to kind of make the change, for a lot of people it is relatively hard to kind of go, okay, well, I'm going to leave the academic life and make the jump of running for a political office. For anybody who's not quite at that level or has any understanding or idea of kind of where to start, where would you recommend, or how would you recommend somebody to get involved, or where to start that they can make a difference in the world and society around them?
I mean, there are so many different ways. Obviously there are endless, there are lots of nonprofits, there are lots of causes, there are things you can do in your own backyard. I will just talk about the political if you want to be more involved in the political process, right? What I tell folks to do, there are a couple ways of approaching it. One is adopt a few campaigns, that these are the places where you're going to put your weight and your effort. And there are two, campaigning is very much manual labor in a sense. It's not, you can do some help on the policy side and creating the sort of the policy profile for a candidate. But, I really rarely get more than 30 seconds to talk about any kind of public policy. Really, what it's about is raising the money to communicate with the voters or communicating with the voters. And so the two asks, I always have of folks are, being involved in the fundraising side of the campaign, or being involved in the outreach. We do phone banking, we do door knocking, and so what I tell folks is, pick a couple campaigns and just make those your cause. You are going to weigh in whatever ways you can to make a difference in that place, whether it's a city council race or it's a congressional race or, a state house or Senate race. And I would say, at the local level, those state house and Senate races, you can make an enormous impact. And it is, even the congressional race, you might think it's big time, but it's just a few of us sitting around a table, being involved. Someone who just shows up regularly, right, can have an enormous impact on our process and on our system. So, everybody should know that, at least if you're interested in that universe of things, there's enormous opportunity.
Perfect. Thank you.
I want to add just one more follow-up. the call to students that public administration is a great degree to prepare you for possibly a political career, but certainly a career in public service and service of the greater good. Are you on board with that message?
Yes, I am. Yes. And I think what the MPA and MPP give you is just greater depth of knowledge about public policy. And you're more able to move through the world in a way that is three-dimensional, as opposed to, if you don't have those degrees, you may learn a lot of it on the job. I'm not saying you have to have one, but often you will be tracked into a very narrow, small area. And that is what you will know very, very well. And what the MPA and MPP do is give you the broader breadth of knowledge that allow you to move intelligently and to understand ways to build out from that narrow area and to be more effective at that job.
Lovely. Thank you so much for sharing that with us and sharing your experience and your ideas and the commitment that you have shown to the field over time and has changed is really quite remarkable. And I think I really appreciate it.
Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.